The May 21st, 2026 Board of Ed meeting was just under 5 hours long. It started off with recognizing the Teachers of the Year, Powers of the Year, the different professional awards, as well as the retirees. They were given plaques. Everybody had cake at the end. That was about an hour and a half to 2 hours long. The meeting started at 5 o'clock. The reason the meeting started at 5 o'clock was to ensure that they had quorum. One of the members had to leave, they said at 7 o'clock. They actually hung out to about 8 o'clock before leaving. I'm going to get into that when we get to the consent agenda. As I said, the awards were almost 2 hours. Then instead of going into executive session like they typically do, they had the committee reports being read, and there was a lot of information in the committee reports. I want to say a lot of good information, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of glaze over it because nothing that was said there is going to immediately change what happens in the district. Then there were comments from both the public as well as the Board of Ed members. One of the things that was a reoccurring theme both last time when talking about the budget and at this meeting was people were getting up and they're like, why don't you get rid of membeams, which is apparently a vocabulary program. I did not know anything about membeams until the budget hearings started. And they were like, can we keep a teacher instead and get rid of this program? Now, it is my understanding that I want to say it was like $130 something thousand in education program was cut. I'm not positive about that. I believe I heard that last time. I heard that somewhere. I don't know. There was a list or a kind of review of some of the programs that were being cut. Membeans was one of the ones that was being kept. Now, one of the Board of Ed members, Ms. Hoffman, said, I want to make it really clear. We do not decide what programs are being cut and what programs stay. So I get that the public is getting up and saying, hey, maybe you can find money to keep a teacher by cutting membeams or ALEX. ALEX is apparently a math program that not only are people cheating on, they're paying other students to do the work for them. This was something that was mentioned by the Vice President, Patrick Joe, last meeting. And then the student rep, Chris Cha, echoed what other students got up and said about these programs and said, yes, this is true. This is happening. You're paying for these programs and, they're not being used the way they're intended to be used. And Ms. Hoffman said, we don't decide what programs to keep. We don't decide what faculty to keep. All we decide is if somebody says we recommend to renew this or we recommend to up this contract, we can vote yes or no on it. When the superintendent says, hey, I'm going to let this person go, unless they do a Donaldson hearing and apply, basically say we want the Board of Ed to reconsider our my position, they cannot vote yes or no. They don't have a vote on that. So all they can really do is make the recommendations, which is something that I said in the last meeting. Then the board attorney said, well, you actually have a lot of power. You can kind of steer the ship. And if you don't like the way it's going, you do the evaluation for the superintendent. You can give him a bad evaluation, which once again is exactly what I said in my video. They can make recommendations. If those recommendations are ignored, they can then give the superintendent a bad evaluation, and that is the extent of what they could do. When they patched the budget, and this was explained again and talked about in great detail, they are saying this is X amount of dollars. So you as the district have X amount of dollars to work with. However, they don't decide where the money gets cut and what programs get cut. So I also saw that there were a lot of questions about the girls' flag football. I hope that answers it. It is the district, it is the superintendent who makes that decision. Yes, things can be suggested by the Board of Ed, but ultimately it is the district who makes that decision. So they went into executive session. Executive session was longer, they knew this. There was a Donaldson hearing where a staff member was appealing to the Board of Ed for them to vote for him to basically reinstate him so he would be able to keep his job. They came back out and they voted on the consent agenda. I'm going to go over that in a little bit more detail than I typically do for the Board of Ed meetings. So under finance, there was the bills list was approved. And I'm just really going to kind of point out the stuff that wasn't approved. The bills list was approved. A approval for business administrator certification, the acceptance of scholarship donations, approval of different fundraisers, approval of donations. This was not approved. So there was a learn well agreement, which is basically, I believe we sent a student out, and the tuition was only $625, but there was a $2,064.15 administration fee. So Ms. Hoffman questioned, why is the administration fee so much more than the tuition? Mr. Halcinato Calvin, I'm sorry, I'm killing his name here, said that was something he had to look into. So Ms. Hoffman said, while, since I don't know the specific information for that and I don't have an answer because, you have to look into it, I don't feel comfortable passing it without knowing the details. So there were 5 members at the start of the meeting. At 8 o'clock, Mr. Bork did have to leave. Mr. Crisolios wasn't able to make the meeting. So anything that one person either voted no on or had to abstain on did not pass, because you need quorum for it to pass, right? So you need at least 4 people to say yes for a motion to pass. So the learn well agreement failed. Then there was the approval of tuition to send students out of district. There were 3 of those that passed. There was a renewal of the district's dental. Now here's the problem. Mr. Grippo's wife is a secretary in one of the buildings. He has to abstain. Because he had to abstain, it couldn't pass because there wasn't enough people. They didn't have the quorum to carry it. So they needed 4 votes to say yes. Because he had to abstain, they only had 3 yes votes. Therefore, that did not pass. There was a school physician in sports medicine services through Columbia University. Basically, and I did not know this, there is a doctor, a school doctor that goes, we all know Dan, who is the trainer. This is an actual doctor who goes to some of the sporting events, and that's what that service is through. There was the approval of an independent auditor, a contract with High Focus Centers of Comprehensive School Clearance Assessments, authorization with Omnia Partners Cooperative Purchasing Program, approval of submission of the tax levy schedule, approval of an amendment to revision 2 of the 25-26 ESEA application, and then approval of the submission of this year's ESEA application, approval of Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, approval of petty cash, approval of the 26-27 athletics funds, and then approval of a mandatory direct deposit program. Under student services, they approved class trips. Under operations, they approved the PTA to use the auditorium on June 4th. Now, this did not have a discussion. I'm going to interject my personal opinion here. So there was a use of substandard instructional space for the 2026-2027 school year applications at Bergen Boulevard and Slocum. I'm going to say this. That sounds really scary. I do not know what it is. I am not in the schools. I do not know what it is. There was not a discussion of it, at least in public, there was not a discussion of it. However, knowing a number of educators, there are very specific guidelines that each classroom has to follow. And it doesn't mean that the classrooms aren't safe or that they harm the kids in any way. In fact, I believe it specifically says that in the appeal or form that they submit, that the classrooms are safe and that they're working on correcting it. Obviously, that would take money. So that was sent in. Once again, I don't know the specifics. I just think that the wording of that is a little scary. However, you can always follow up with the Board of Ed if you do have specific, or the district really, if you have specific questions about that. Then there was a ratification of a bid, to put a bid out to advertise it and then select a bid for the repair of a wall. Personnel. There was leave approval. There was an appointment for a non-certified, essentially teacher's aides. There was a revision of personnel for tenured admins, teachers, and secretaries for the 26-27 school year. Then there were revisions for non-tenured admins, teachers, and secretaries. Then revisions for person report of clerical aides, custodians, bus drivers, teachers' assistants, and then approval for home instruction, events, state workers, and student-age children care workers. They also approved a student teacher. They approved summer teacher subs, subs for teacher assistants and nurses. And then they rescinded an appointment of a teacher's assistant. And there was also an approval of payment to mentors for novice teachers. Now, under here, there was an authorization for summer hiring, emergent hiring, which failed. So apparently this is a standard practice that they say, okay, well, if the superintendent needs to hire someone over the summer, he has the power to do so. The superintendent says he has never used that, even though it has always been granted to him in the past, he has never needed to use it in the past. Ms. Hoffman said, I just feel nervous essentially writing a blank check because we're still meeting during the summer. You have retroactive power. I don't feel comfortable in just saying, hey, if you need to, you can make the decision to hire somebody on your own as the board. That's why we're put here. And I don't feel comfortable, writing a blank check. The other members who were there did vote yes, but once again, because there were only 4 members voting, all 4 members needed to be in agreement for anything to carry. So it did not carry. Policy, like I said, there was a large policy discussion. However, nothing was voted on tonight. Legal, there was an HIB case. And then there were walk-on resolutions. There was a walk-on resolution urging relief from rising public schools, employment, health care costs. I'm going to assume that this was sent to the state. And then here is the walk-on resolution that everybody was waiting for, and it was to reinstate an employee. That employee is the one who had the Donaldson hearing. And all of that passed. So that teacher who all the students came out and spoke for tonight was reinstated. Now, he needs to get a letter from the board. Everything needs to be finalized. So for the students who are watching this, I don't know if you email him and say, hey, are you good? If he can email you back and say yes right away. But the vote to reinstate him did carry. I hope that helps you. Have a great night.